This is an interview with Ivan Torkelson for the Valley Historical Project, and he's just given us coffee and cookies, so I think we're ready to settle down for an hour or two. The interviewer is Harriet Blockus, and I'm assisted by Ken Blockus, and also in attendance are Margaret and Tom Foxwell. And today is the 12th of March, 1998, and we are doing this interview in the Torkelson home. We want to thank you, Ivan, for granting us this interview. The material will be used to interpret the heritage of our region. It will be used primarily for educational purposes, but it may also be used in promoting economic development and tourism. I think you understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we get started? And will you give us your full name?
Ivan Earl Torkelson.
And where were you born and when?
Well, I was born right here in Elgin. In fact, I was born in the house right behind the park that Cheryl Nielsen lives in at the present time. And I was born at Christmas Day, 1929.
A nice Christmas present. Where were your parents born?
Mother and Dad were born in Clayton County near the Highland Lutheran Church, and they were neighbors, basically. There was one farm in between them, so they grew up together, basically.
And so neither you nor your parents immigrated to the United States. What about grandparents?
Yeah, my grandfather, Torkelson, immigrated, and I don't think grandmother did. I think she was born here in this country.
And where did he come from?
Oh, I can't tell you the exact. You have to talk to Corrine and Arlene Skoyan for that.
But it was Norway.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Norway. Oh, excuse me. Yes, yes.
Okay, but you don't know the exact place. That's fine. And could you tell us a little bit, Ivan, about your education?
Well, basically here, just in the old Elgin High School, and then I did attend Luther College for 1 year, and decided then to come home and go into business.
That was quite typical of your generation to go to Luther for 1 year. It seems like I know a lot of people that did that.
Well, some were good enough to keep going.
I believe your brother graduated from there, didn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And would you tell us a little bit about who you married and when?
Well, I married Eleanor Schutte from Postville, and we were married in 1954 in October. I actually met her in Cedar Rapids, and that's a story of itself, if you'd like to hear it. But
that's fine.
We'll talk about that later.
So
Maybe.
you can go ahead.
Well, a friend of mine, Carlisle Kirkeberg, was going with a girl from Postville as well that worked in Cedar Rapids, and he kept telling me that I should go with him some weekend to go down to visit and meet this Eleanor Schutte. And I kept saying I need to get a call and make arrangements, and he said no, I should just come on down. So we went down and we got there on a Saturday afternoon, and here was Eleanor, who had a date with a sailor for the weekend. And but I was kind of taken, and so we did go back later and got acquainted.
You kind of learned that you can't always take advice from Kai.
Right, right.
Okay. Would you like to tell us about the places that you've lived in Elgin?
Well, when we were first married, we lived in the house that Randy anyway lives. It used to belong to the school, and it did at that time, and they didn't have anybody living in the house, and so they said that if we wanted to rent the upstairs apartment, there was a teacher downstairs, and I can't remember his name right now either, but so we got it all painted and fixed up, and shortly after we got moved in, the school decided they were going to need it for another teacher that fall, so we had to move out and moved in with my folks while we built this house.
Was that the one that Mr. Robinson lived in?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That would be on the corner. Oh, let's see. DeWitt.
Randy Witt lives there now.
Yeah, Randy Witt lives there now. Okay. And so you've only lived in 3 houses?
That's all.
In all your lifetime?
Yep.
That's good.
Pretty unique nowadays.
That is very unique. So that's why we like to talk to people like you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about what professions you've been in?
Basically one profession. I went to Luther, like I said, for a year and decided that, well, at the time my uncle, Otto, who was kind of really managing the business, Dad had started the locker in the meantime, and Bob Fobb wanted to get into the international harvester business, and so he approached my uncle to buy the business because Uncle Otto was getting tired of it. And when I heard that, I said, no way, we're not going to let that happen. So I quit college and came home and went into the business.
And you've been there ever since.
Yeah.
And we hear you on the radio every day. Can you tell us about Eleanor's work?
Well, she was a housewife for a number of years, and then she worked in the bank for a while, and then she went to the Palmer Lutheran Hospital in West Union, worked in the kitchen for a year about, and then now she's been a ward clerk ever since, and probably will be retiring this year, I hope.
She's probably, with all the trips you have to make with your job, which we'll talk about later, she's probably finding a little bit of a bind getting to work.
Right.
Okay, now we're going to move back a little bit. Do you have any, when I say childhood memories, just what comes into your mind?
Oh, I guess probably just as I think back, and after having lived these years and traveled a fair amount, just the joy of growing up in a little town has been just outstanding. When I think of the fun things and the activities that we did as young people around a little town like Elgin, those are really memorable in my mind.
Could you tell us specifically about any of those special things that were so much fun, that made this a special town?
Well, like, for instance, we're looking out here across the valley and we used to hike over there, and we hiked those hills. I don't even know who they belonged to at those days, but we spent a lot of time over there. Good outdoor activities. There's what used to be called a slough back there, and we would carry our snow shovels back there in the wintertime and shovel the snow so that we could ice skate. You know, now you have to build a lighted pond probably, which we don't have in Elgin. Sometimes I think we should have a skating pond, but we don't. But, you know, we used to make our own fun, make our own activities, and a lot of kids worked together, all good friends. I remember a time on a very winter ice, we had a terrible ice storm. And, of course, now, you know, it really doesn't affect things a lot. Businesses continue on and everybody continues to do their thing. You know, whatever happens, we complain because they don't get the roads plowed and so on. But anyway, this ice storm came, and of course, it just closed the town down. Nobody was concerned about it. We just, you know, the businesses might be open, but there was nothing going on. Well, Tad Shorey, who is a great guy, hooked a long rope behind his little Chevrolet coupe, put chains on it, and he spent the day driving around the streets of Elgin with this rope dangling behind so the kids could grab a hold of the rope and skate around on the streets around town. The only problem was that I had been selling newspapers and tried to make enough money to order some, and I did order from Montgomery Ward a set of shoe skates, but not knowing that this ice storm was coming. So I still had my old clamp on ice skates, and they kept falling off all day. So I didn't have as much fun as those kids with the shoe skates that day.
Did he pull anybody on a sled?
No, I don't think he would allow anybody on a sled. It was just ice skates, as I recall. But it was a great day.
I can see that would be. Do you have any school memories of, like, elementary school? We'll start with first. Can you remember any Christmas program or anything like that?
Oh, I guess I don't really remember Christmas programs. I remember our little great Elgin school gym and how we used to get packed in there for basketball games. Ken would remember those. And I remember a number of the teachers. I remember an event, Miss Dunkel was one of my most, as I think back, of my grade school teachers. I think I had her in third grade, and I apparently didn't spend much time trying to learn to read, and she found that I couldn't read in the third grade, so she said, "You will stay after school until you learn to read." Thank goodness I had a teacher like that to give me a little extra tutoring. I don't know, those were real dedicated people. And I also remember one time when Lloyd Capper, who was a year older, and of course we had 2 classes in each grade, swallowed a marble. And Miss Dunkel, who wasn't very tall, but quite a good gal, she picked Lloyd up by the feet and pounded his head on the floor till the marble rolled out. I remember that was an interesting experience. So we had, and then we had a teacher named Miss Schultz, who went on to marry Howdy Roberts, who later became famous as a band leader and a personality on WMT radio. That was kind of a great event in Elgin when we found out that she was going to be part of a celebrity family.
Very good.
Yeah.
Do you have any high school memories, maybe?
Well, I don't know how many people you've interviewed, but I'm sure everyone has talked about Miss Crow.
No,
Not yet.
not yet.
Okay. Well,
Keep
what a
it positive.
what a wonderful person she was. I can't remember how many years she taught in Elgin, 30, whatever. And she was quite a heavy lady and a tremendous disciplinarian. Boy, Ken remembers that too. In school, you did what you were supposed to do, and you didn't step out of line 1 minute. But she had a telltale sign if she was coming up to the aisle, and we sat in the assembly at that time. We had to join, we'd get there between classes and sit in our own assigned seat. And she, of course, wore an aisle on her, I suppose, silk hose in those days, and she was quite a heavy lady, and so if you heard this coming up the aisle, you better straighten up because she was coming up behind you. She was a great gal.
Well, I'm glad you have so many pleasant memories of your teachers, having been a teacher myself. Now let's move over to what do you remember about the town of Elgin, and let's start with the stores, because you were involved in business. What are some early memories that you have about the stores of Elgin?
Well, of course, one thing well, most of it has changed, but we had, let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think at one time we had 6 grocery stores in Elgin. Small little stores, I don't know, they all survived, they all did their thing. And of course we had more localized shopping in those days. People didn't get in their car and drive 50 or 100 miles to buy groceries. So the area, and there was a greater population in the rural area, so they all kept going. I worked in one. I worked for Myrtle Kohler in what goes back farther to be called the Holstanson store, and it was right across from our dealership where the Crammond, Mrs. Crammond owns that building now. And I worked there in the early 40s, and I would go down every morning and build a fire in the furnace and sweep the floor and do a little grocery stocking and get it ready for the day. But of course it took quite a while, so I had a special arrangement with Miss Crow that I could be about 5 or 10 minutes late every morning getting to school, because I just could not get there at 5 minutes to 9. So but I better not be more than that late, because she wouldn't be very happy about that. But I did work there for a number of years, and that was, in those days we didn't have automatic furnaces. I hauled in the coal and built the fire and got it stoked up for Myrtle and Reva Torkelson worked there as a clerk at that time. We took in eggs. On Saturday morning, my job was to candle eggs, because that was the people would bring their eggs in and trade them out in groceries. It was a great experience.
Would you explain what candling is?
Oh, well, there was a little box with a hole in it, just a little bit smaller than the egg, and you would hold the egg up. There was a light inside the box. You'd hold the egg up to the hole and to see if there was any bloody spots or if it was a good fresh egg. That's how you determined that it was a fresh egg or not.
Oh, good. And would you tell us what kind of floors? When you had to sweep the floors, what were the floors in these stores
Just
like?
wooden board floors, and of course that meant we used sweeping compound, which I don't know that anybody knows about anymore, but that's a mixture of sawdust and a little bit of sand and oil, and that would keep the dust from rolling too badly and kind of scrub things up a little bit. But that was an every morning job to clean up the dust and dirt from the day before, because there was a lot of dirt got tracked in from the previous day's business.
I'm glad you said something about the sweeping compound, because no one has, and anyone that's over 60, I think, remembers sweeping compound.
Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit about the churches in the town at that time?
Well,
or through the years?
Yeah. Well, early on, of course, there was not a Lutheran church here. We had the Baptist and the Lutheran. And the Methodist, and then in 1950. I think 1951 or thereabouts anyway, the Elgin Lutheran Church was started, in fact it was started while I was in the service, so I was not here at the very beginning of it. And there was a little controversy about that, because the two Claremont churches were a little concerned that they might lose their membership, and of course Highland, which was the parent congregation for Elgin Lutheran, and they were concerned about that there. But and I'm sure that there was a little shuffling going on, but basically I think we took in a lot of new members. But and then in 19 let's see, 54, 55, then the Apostolic moved into town, and they're located right next to our house here, and so they moved their church from the country, so we now have the 4 churches.
Tell us what the roads were like when you remember as a child. What were the roads coming into Elgin like?
Well, a lot of them were barely gravel, if even gravel. Of course, in town we had hard surfaced roads. In most cases, I think most of the streets around town were. But before we started our Lutheran church here, and of course we went to Highland in those days, and that was a real task to get to church on Sunday morning, driving 10 miles on dirt roads, and many times such mud conditions that I don't know how we did get through. But it was a lot of struggling to get to here and there in those days.
I think at one time the Highland and East Claremont and West Claremont and Elgin were together. Like, did they have the same pastor?
Well, before the church started in Elgin, yes, the 3 churches, Highland, East, and West, shared a pastor, and so it's a lot of times we would have services only every 3 weeks out in Highland because it was a real chore to get there in the wintertime. And so I grew up kind of a half Methodist, because then in between we'd go to the Methodist church. We went to Sunday school at the Methodist church all our younger days, and we went and attended their Christmas programs and all that kind of thing, because we didn't have Sunday school out of Highland at all at that time.
What do you remember about what Saturday nights were like?
It was a big time in any small town, I'm sure. It was now we have, parallel parking. In those days we had curb parking, whatever you call it, and the streets were absolutely full of cars from about 7 o'clock on, and the kids were wandering the streets. Hanashioc had his little popcorn stand right next to where Leonard Roberts and Leo Fobbs building is, right in between there, and boy, that was a busy place on Saturday nights and Wednesday nights as far as that goes. We were open, the town was open 2 nights. And of course for years, and I don't remember exactly whether it was a band concert twice a week, probably just once a week, but then the old bandstand stood right next to the sidewalk, and all Max Thoma and Gordon Mosby and Cliff Christ, and I think both the Million Dollar Twins, Clarence and Lawrence, and anyway, they had a really good little town band, and they had a concert every Saturday night. It was a great event in Elgin, well, in any small town, I'm sure, but that was a fun time to be in a small town.
And the children could be free from their parents for a couple hours and just do what they liked.
Run the streets. Maybe they had a nickel in their pocket to buy an ice cream cone or a bag of popcorn, but not both probably. But it was a great experience growing up in that environment in a small town. Well, the German band was another group, part of those same people, but that was another, and they kind of entertained on more special events such as homecoming and various things. That's another whole story. I don't know if anybody's talked about that, but anyway, I know the German band was kind of pretty well recognized around the area, and I remember hearing the story, it was before my time, that someone had sponsored a special train to a Cubs baseball game in Chicago, and of course in those days they like to have fun, and so the German band went along, and they played on the train on the way to Chicago, as I understand. And then it was not planned, but somehow it was arranged, and they played down the field before the game, or at the 7th inning stretch or whatever. And I guess that was quite an event for those guys that were part of that band.
No one's told that.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, we had a lot of bands. In fact, Tad Shorey, as I mentioned earlier, and I can't remember Gordon Mosby. What did they call themselves? They had a regular little dance band that they traveled around northeastern Iowa playing. So
they didn't have disc jockeys.
No.
They had, things were a little different then. You could take a train. Can you remember ever taking a train out of Elgin?
Yeah, a couple of times, and that was That was on the Rock Island from Elgin to West Union to the fair. That was kind of a traditional event. Back in those days, the county fair, they would highlight one town in the county on different days throughout the fair, or at least the town would recognize the fair, and so basically the town would close up, or the businesses would close, and then the parents would all go to the fair, at least in the afternoon. Well, the kids would get on the train at the Rock Island Depot in Elgin, and about 8 o'clock in the morning, as I remember, and ride the train to West Union, and then the parents would come in the afternoon, usually with a picnic, and pick us up and take us back home again. But it was not a passenger train as such. We rode in the caboose. It was just a freight train with a caboose in the back end. Very not exactly clean. No restroom facilities. So yeah, that was about the extent of passenger service in my day. But I understand prior to that there were 7 or 8 or 10 trains a day through Elgin that would go in all directions.
You know what it cost?
Oh, I don't remember. Probably a dime or 15 cents or something of that nature. I don't recall, but the cost was very small. In fact, I don't think they let us ride for nothing, but it was. And then we maybe had another quarter or 50 cents with us beside that we would have to spend at the fair during the day. So we had to be pretty frugal in our spending.
Could you tell us a little bit about the hatchery or the canning factory?
Well, I never worked in the canning factory. But a lot of people did, of course. That was kind of the part-time activity. It was a fun place to go. In those days, we'd wander through while the thing was going on, and we didn't have all the OSHA regulations that we have today. And so you'd always spend some time there. And, of course, there was always a little unique part of that. If anyone has explained the cooling tanks at the canning factory, well, when the big kettles came out of the cookers, of course they were very, very hot, and so there was a long tank of water along the side of the building, and so these kettles would go down and would go on a track clear to the other end of the factory through this cooling tank to cool the cans. And then when it would get to the end, it would come up around a sharp corner to go into the room where they would then take the cans out of the kettles and put them in boxes. Well, occasionally, if a kettle was pretty full and it would kind of swing around that corner pretty fast, a can of corn would bounce out of the kettle and fall down in the corner. Well, there was a screen around there, but we'd always seem to find a way to work the screen up a little bit and get down under there with a stick and fish that can out. And I don't know what was so great about it, but we would eat a can of corn right then and there. It was still about lukewarm, so it was great to eat. That was a kind of a fun little activity while the factory was being run.
Did you ever get to have the baby chickens from them?
Oh, I think once or twice. The culls, as they call them, the ones that what were those? I can't. What did that mean? I've forgotten even.
Well, sometimes later on they didn't want the roosters.
Okay, I suppose that's what it was. Yeah. Anyway, Mother or Dad would get 10 or 15 of those, and we had a little fence in the backyards and raised some chickens. I was never very happy about that. I'm not a very good farmer, I guess, but I didn't want to mess with those chickens, and I always knew it meant cleaning dumb things later on after they got big enough to butcher.
You didn't like to butcher the chickens?
No way. But the hatchery, of course, was a big thing when that was going. That was really, well, I think it was one of the world's largest hatcheries of some particular nature. I've forgotten, but I do remember when they were in full swing, they would ship so many chickens that they would be, the canning factory, or the hatchery was where F&F Hardware is, and they would have crates of chickens on the sidewalks and every place waiting to go through the post office to be postage applied, and then they had a special truck that hauled them to a train in, I think, Quasqueton or someplace, and that was a full-time session there. Well, they went south someplace. Well, they probably did go to Postville. That was a different train, but they went south too, because Odie would go along sometimes to help unload those. But
well, they mailed the chickens.
They were mailed all over the United States, as I understand. And I don't know how those little chicks survived in a train, but apparently they did.
You suppose the people working in the post office had to feed them?
I don't know. They probably put a little something in with them, I suppose, to keep them going. I don't know. And I suppose maybe they got to their destination fairly quick, I don't know.
Now let's move on to some of the businesses that you were involved in, and your father and his brothers. Would you like to start with which one started first?
Well, in 1926, my father and three of his brothers, my father Clarence and Tom and Carl and Otto Torkelson, who were farmers in Clayton County near the Highland Church, decided they wanted to get in the implement business. So they made an arrangement with to buy the business that had originally been started by my great uncle Halver Knudsen, and that's the same. Halver built the building that we still occupy and run. And so actually I think they came in 1925. Uncle Otto kind of came in there a little bit early, but at any rate they started with International Harvester, or McCormick Deering as it was called in those days, I think. And then the next year, I think Dad was kind of the mainstay of getting into the automobile business, and in fact we have copies, a whole box full of letters that Dad had started writing to various automobile companies around the United States back in the teens already, to get information. He must have dreamed about being in the automobile business even probably before he went in the service, because I think some of those things date back, and I sorry to say that a lot of those have disappeared, but I remember a whole series of letters that he got from the Studebaker Corporation. Apparently he'd written to Studebaker, and they probably had this already pre-written, but they would send him a letter, and then a week later he would get another letter explaining about the Studebaker car, and the next week he'd get another letter, and it was a kind of a build-up to try and convince them to be a dealer. There were hundreds and hundreds of models of cars built in those days, and
Did you say your father's name?
Clarence, yeah. And anyway, then in 1926, four brothers came to town, I guess green maybe isn't a very good word, but not very business astute, to start this automobile business and International Harvester. And they kind of took their individual parts of it. Tom and Carl seemed to be more mechanically inclined, and they were very inclined, and they took the mechanical part of the business. In fact, they established a regular full-time machine shop with turning lathes and all the equipment that was necessary for that. And then later, as welding became common, they built their own electric welder. They never went out to buy things. They built their own.
My goodness.
In fact, they built a water well drilling machine which was very unique, because they later went into the well drilling business. But they just loved mechanical things, and instead of buying something, they would just make it. That was their.
They would invent it.
Yep. In fact, it was told that many of the early farm implements that they had used on the farm themselves, tractors and whatever, they could soon realize that there were need for improvement on those machines. They hadn't been designed very well, and they were very, very good about figuring out ways to make them work better. There was one particular tractor that I know they told about that just absolutely could not get it started. They would just work for hours, and they figured out some way to put some little extra igniter in there and then it would start. Well, then other farmers that owned that same tractor would come and have them put that on their particular one. But anyway, then as the business started to become organized, then Dad and Uncle Otto were kind of the sales and business part of the business. And Dad tells about, in those days, trading in horses on tractors and trading in whatever, horses probably on cars, and of course part of the job was, if you sold a car, you had to go to the person and go with them and teach the people how to drive, because they didn't know how to drive. So that was long before the driver education programs we have today. So he did a lot of that, and some harrying experiences he used to tell about.
Did you remember him telling anything about scaring horses, or?
Well, I don't remember that exactly. I guess that probably was an earlier time, because this would have been in the late 20s now.
Mm-hmm.
But and those horses that they kept trading in on tractors, of course, were useless by this time, and so they would allow some trade-in value to the farmer, but in many cases they just left them on the farm and just whatever happened to them because they didn't, there's nothing, they couldn't resell them again. So there was, that was part of their learning experience that it wasn't a very profitable venture that way to take in something in trade that you couldn't resell. But anyway, that was the very beginning of the business. Then in 1946, International Harvester became very dictatorial, and they insisted that there was no business that could have joint operations. And so they insisted that we either quit International, or Chrysler, because we'd gone, oh, I guess I didn't mention that, it was Chrysler Corporation that we started in with. To my knowledge, we are the oldest active Chrysler business in the state of Iowa.
The oldest in the state of Iowa.
Yeah, I'm almost sure of that. It's still in the same family.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we were recognized at a national Chrysler new car showing in Orlando, Florida, a couple of years ago by being recognized as one of the oldest dealers in the country.
Well, how many years was that?
This would be the 81st year now. 82nd year, excuse me. We're into another year now.
82nd.
Yeah.
82 years.
82 years.
Wow.
So it's been around a long time. I wish we had some of those old cars that were sold in those days, but we don't.
When did you get into the business?
Well, then, as I mentioned earlier, when my Uncle Otto wanted to sell the business, I just couldn't quite tolerate that because the Faub family was our competitor in those days, of course, and to sell out the stock.
Here. Yeah, and turn it over. Jerry, turn it over. You can drink coffee anytime. That makes it more interesting.
You want that?
Yeah. I just about had a coughing spell. I was afraid.
We had a little problem there, so I'll stop it.
And so now we're going to continue telling about your getting into the car business after your uncle.
Well, as I mentioned, the possibility of the business being sold to our competitor wasn't very exciting to me, and so that was when I quit college then and came home in 1949, well, 48, 49 that we actually went into the business. So my brother and I, Otis, bought 1/4 of the business. We bought this Uncle Otto. We bought his share of the business because he really wanted to retire. And so then for a few years it was kind of a mixed up affair, but we had Dad and his two brothers and my brother and I all together. It wasn't exactly the greatest arrangement, but we survived. Then in 1951, then the other two uncles sold their interest to us, and so then it was operated by my father and my brother and I until 1964, I believe it was, when then my brother and I divided the business into two parts, and the farm water system business that had been evolved into the operation. My brother took that part of it, and I took the automobile part. Oh, I guess I didn't finish telling about International Harvester, did I? But I can, if you're ready for that. But at any rate, they became very dictatorial in 1946, and they insisted that you couldn't have two businesses in the same building. So they insisted that we build a new building, and we just didn't feel it was practical in the small town of Elgin, so we discontinued the franchise with International Harvester.
They took that over then.
Pardon? Then that's when Bob Fobb took it after a short time. He started with it then and operated.
He and Lyle Light.
Yeah, well, Lyle came in later. Bob started alone to begin with, and then Lyle came in as a partner soon after. I can't remember exactly when. But anyway, International Harvester got into serious trouble over that, and they were prosecuted and fined by the federal government for trying to create a monopoly or forcing undue. I remember we had apparently the FBI was conducting the investigation, and I remember this FBI guy that came to Elgin and interviewed my father and my uncle, and this would have been in 1946 or 7.
So they had lawsuits then.
Yes, they had lawsuits then too. So International Harvester lost, and after that, then they could not force that particular program that they had tried to do. But we didn't. It was a good thing in the long run, because as the implement business evolved and the automobile business, there's no way you could have run the two businesses in our present building and location. So it would have meant major changes. And so,
When did your son come into the business?
well, in 1977, no, wait a minute, 1980, I got to 78, excuse me, 1978. Bruce went to Luther College, like everybody else in the family did, and but he apparently was not a very good student, or I mean, I shouldn't say he was not a very good student, but he was not the kind to want to sit in a classroom. I think he was very.
This wasn't his interest.
That's right. Good way to put it. Thanks, Harriet. At any rate, about 6 weeks after the fall session had started, we were having lunch here, and the door opened, and I looked, and here was Bruce standing there with his bags. He came home. He said he had enough. Well, that was back in I think there was a lot of turmoil going on at Luther, too, in those days, and he had a roommate that was smoking marijuana, and Bruce couldn't stand that, and they wouldn't give him a new roommate, so he said, that's enough of that, so he came home.
So he got into the business.
So then he decided, I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I want to work in the business. And so, you know, he was 18 years old, and I said, oh, okay, so what's he going to do, wash cars? Which he at that time was quite almost shy. He wasn't a very outgoing person, and so I couldn't vision him as being a salesperson at that time. And that's actually what he did. He washed cars for a while. Well, then the opportunity came to open a business and walk on, and Chrysler, we worked with Chrysler on that and did. And so Bruce said, well, I'll go up there. Well, he was 19 years old.
That was quite a challenge.
Yeah. Well, of course, there's a little interesting sidelight to that. When I was 19 years old was when I went into the business.
Oh.
And
so he was following Dad's footsteps.
And we didn't think about that. In fact,
you thought you were ready, didn't you?
I don't know. I was stubborn enough or dumb enough to think it was. But a thing happened then that I'm sure that was unique with Chrysler Corporation. They must not have checked my age, because when we signed the franchise with Chrysler, I signed that franchise along with my brother and the family, the rest of the uncles and dad, as a 19-year-old, and I wasn't even legally capable of doing that. And I since have gotten to know a lot of the officials in Chrysler, and I said, I'm probably the youngest dealer that you've had, as well as being now the oldest, who probably was the youngest at one time. Well, at any rate, then, as I say, Bruce started in the management position up there and walk on, and so he started at that age. Well, then son Dirk did finish 4 years at Luther and came home, and he'd been offered a job, different jobs. One of them was a bank in Des Moines, and he went down there and interviewed and came home, and they called and said, you can have the job. And he looked at me and he said, Dad, he said, I can't sit behind a desk and argue with people about paying their loans. He says, that's just not my bag either. So he says, I want to stay here. Okay, so the business hadn't been all that good to us over the years, and so I really was not very happy about them making that decision. Because
this was a big deal for you to work in 3 families.
Yeah. So I said, okay, we'll struggle with it, and it was a struggle for a number of years, but I give them all the credit due to their persistence and hard work. Why, it's turned out we're still here anyway. But.
And today you're the only dealership here.
Yeah, and as it turned out, then the fob competitor that we had finally decided that they would consolidate their operations, so they're now in West Union, not in Elgin at all, which we're not really happy about. I wish they were still here.
Well, we want to congratulate you on your perseverance to stick it out all these years. Could you tell us a little bit about the locker and why we don't need lockers?
Oh, okay. Well, then, right after, well, I guess it was actually before the war, before World War II actually finished, why the need for a better way to preserve meat, I guess, rather than everybody canning it in glass jars or tin cans, why they decided, well, the refrigeration industry started to blossom, so it was quite common that there would be these large locker plants built that had hundreds of individual boxes that you could rent that I don't know, a couple feet square that you could put frozen meat in, or put meat in and it was frozen. So Dad thought that that would be a way for him to kind of separate out of the automobile business and get into another field. And it was a real struggle. Of course, it was right at the end of World War II, and facility equipment was not readily available yet, but they did get the thing together. And of course, to finance it, it was, you know, we've been famous at planning and doing things long before we had the finances to make them work, because that was kind of what the situation was. But people then were asked if they would pay for a month or for a year in advance for the rent of that locker box, which they did do very generously. And it was those funds that helped get the thing financed so it could be built and put together.
What would you say killed the locker?
Well, then, of course, eventually then the home food freezers were available and low cost enough that individual families could own them, and our refrigerators now, of course, have freezers, and so the need for that ended.
So when REC came in and brought electricity to the farmers, they got refrigerators and freezers the very first thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of took care of them.
Yeah. And of course, in cities, of course, that's not not very common practice. But out here, where we have meat available and butcher slaughterhouses that can for individual processing, why, of course, it's still quite common. We have a freezer in our basement full of fresh meat all the time, and frozen meat. I mean, and I'm sure most of you do, and that's a thing that's still in use here. But the need for that individual locker box is long gone.
Yeah. Okay. Then we don't want to run out of space, so we want to get to the Elgin American Legion.
Oh, okay.
And a little bit of history, and tell about. Why don't you start out by telling what position you hold right now, and then go back and give us a history of the Legion in Elgin.
Just because it has a little interesting sidelight, I'm going to defer that question for just a second, and I'm going to mention the skating rink that we built above the locker. Hopefully I have time for that. I'll make it quick. At any rate, we were, just high school kids, and we just lobbied really hard with our father and our uncles to build 2 stories on this locker so we could have a skating rink. And they did do that. And because of these ingenuity of these uncles of mine, they also were in the lumber sawing business. And you couldn't buy maple lumber right after the war like that to use for the floor. So my uncles sawed locally maple logs. They sawed them into boards. It was taken to the Kelmer manufacturing plant in Kelmer, where it was milled into flooring boards, and through their kiln was dried and brought back here. And so that floor is all local maple floor, which is kind of interesting. That wouldn't be the way it'd be done today, but.
And they still use it for wedding dances?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. It's not used as much like it used to be, but.
And the bottom part is now
Now it's the Apple Valley Cafe with a couple apartments in the back. That went through a lot of changes. The whole locker plant, it was a bar even at one time, and a small grocery store and a lot of things. So, okay, back to the American Legion. Well, I could go on a long time here. I happen to be serving as the state commander of the American Legion this year, and one of the reasons I think that I've had an interest in that all these years is that Ken and I both grew up with World War I fathers and auxiliary mothers, and so the Legion was a part of our growing up. And it was in those days we hadn't invented babysitters yet, so when there was a Legion or auxiliary meeting, why, we went along, and maybe we'd sleep in the corner or whatever. But
I remember Tootsie Coles always told about those babies that came to auxiliary.
Yep, we had and it was a fun time. I remember Veterans Day potlucks on the Veterans Day night. We called it Armistice Day in those days. We'd have family sing-alongs and just a great time. And of course, the Memorial Day services have always been a very unusual and complete service here in Elgin. I could spend a lot of time just describing how that service is done, but at any rate, I think that instilled a really strong feeling of patriotism and Americanism in most of the young people in the Elgin area because of the activity of the American Legion in our community at that time.
How many generations in your family served in the armed forces?
Well, just my father and myself. Our sons were in between times, so they're
What
not.
about your brother?
And my brother, yeah, and my uncle Carl, and so we've had a lot of connection with the service. Right this month, March, is the month that the American Legion was organized in France in 1919, and I'm presently traveling around the state to what we call Legion birthday parties and speaking.
Why?
Excuse me, why?
Yes, why are you traveling around?
Because I'm the state commander and I'm invited to go. I've driven almost 23,000 miles since last August and have about another 20,000 miles to go before my term will end in July. But at any rate, I've done a lot of research, and my father was in France at this time, and I don't know where Kim's dad was then, but at any rate, we were able to glean some information, or I guess bring some stories back that Dad had told us after his service over there, and one of them was the General Pershing. I found out was concerned about the morale of the troops after the war ended because they were, just sitting around doing nothing, basically waiting to come home, and so they decided that they needed to provide entertainment and recreation for the troops. And Dad told me once that a truck had come to their camp. He was stationed just out of Paris. A truck come to their camp and asked them if anybody wanted to go to the opera in Paris, and he went. And I didn't realize really why, but now I have found out after doing this, and that was the reason. This was one of the activities, I'm sure, that the concern that General Pershing had put together, because they brought them into town. They went to the opera, and of course, for a Clayton County farm boy, that was quite an experience to go to the opera in Paris. So that was a memorable occasion for him. And I did learn another little thing. Dad said then as soon as the opera was over, they put them back in the truck and took them home, back to the camp. And General Pershing, one of his concerns was that he didn't want these troops to be so inactive and just be wandering around the streets of Paris, because the ladies of the night might entice some of these young GI soldiers to get. This is true. I read this in the Legion history just the other day. So that was the reason they took them right back on the truck and took them back to camp again. So I can remember a lot of fun things with the American Legion, and I have a real deep concern that our country needs the kind of activities and the kind of feelings that the American Legion promotes and generates, and so that's why I've been willing to spend a lot of my time with that.
What kind of things does the American Legion promote?
Well, one of course, the major concerns that is the welfare or the care of veterans and their families, and that's, the Legion sponsored the GI Bill, as we call it, which provided the education for those World War II veterans and since, and also the Veterans Administration hospital system that is kind of in trouble right now, but that's a whole story of its own. But those are kind of the things. But my strong feeling is in the Americanism department, and that is where we can promote that kind of feeling especially with our young people, because I feel that the young people that are growing up today don't have that kind of experience that we had as young people growing up in small towns, and with that element as being a part of everyday life. The Legion has a very good oratorical program that goes on. They have a boy state, girl state program. There's a lot of regular activities, but my thrust this year has been to promote education in the schools, and we have put together a very comprehensive flag education program that it hasn't been done out here at Valley in the text that I have since finalized, but I did it impromptu a couple of years ago, and that's where I got the idea. And so that's a very common practice there.
We're really proud to have you be our state commander. One thing, I have two things left that I would like to touch on if we don't run out of tape. And one is, you haven't told about this car trip that started that goes around Iowa that
No.
you participated in?
Well, I obviously having been in the automobile business all my life and being around cars, old cars are an interest of mine. I don't even own one right now. We've had some, but at any rate, 2 years ago, I noticed in the paper that there was going to be a caravan or a drive around Iowa of antique cars, and what a thrill that would be to spend the week with all these people. And so I have a friend in Castalia who I knew had a lot of cars, and so I called him and I said, Lloyd, you ought to go on this trip. No, I haven't got time. And I told him about it. He said, why don't you go? He said, take one of my cars. And so he was kind enough to loan us a 1949 DeSoto, which I drove around the state of Iowa 1,000 miles in a week, and it was a great experience. Then last year they repeated the thing, but I was involved in this Legion activity, so I couldn't go the second time. And they did stop here in Elgin, and we had a great time entertaining them. In fact, I don't know if you read the article in the paper about the compliment that we got, and it also was written up in the mailer that that this association sends out to their, not necessarily members, but the people who are active. And Elgin was given the highlight as being the #1 small town that entertained these people on their week's trip. So we did a good job.
And that kind of leads into the next question I was going to ask you about. If you were to give a short reason why people should visit Elgin or move to Elgin at present day, what reasons would you give for that?
Well, #1 is the friendly, wonderful, caring people that we have here, and people like you, for instance, to take your time to do this, and all of the other activities that we have. The Turkey River is a great recreation area for canoeing. Just the beauty of being in this valley is outstanding. You know, I sit here every morning and eat breakfast and look at your farm right there on top of the hill. It's once in a while the fog rolls through and it looks like mountains. We had a little fog this morning. In fact, it's just beautiful. I think that living in a small town is great, and I encourage people to be here. We had a number of years ago, I was the district commander for the American Legion, and after our term ended, we invited all 9 district commanders and the state commander that was serving at that time to come here for a weekend. And we spent a weekend. We started here and drove through northeastern Iowa and ended back here on Sunday morning for breakfast. And it was in the fall, and God did a wonderful job that day because the sun was shining and the leaves were in their brilliance. And as those people, they stayed in Elgin the night before, and as they came down the Kern Hill into Elgin for breakfast, every one of them, as they walked through the door, they were just in awe. They said, what a beautiful scene that was coming down that valley into Elgin. And they were really impressed. They still talk about it today, those friends of mine that we made back in 1974.
Very good. Do you have any Norwegian or ethnic traditions that you remember about Elgin?
Well, Elgin really isn't, back in those days was not and still isn't, I don't think, a Norwegian community as much as Claremont, but not really. I think.
Do you remember anything about the river with the dividing line?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, that was quite common. The south side of the Turkey River was getting down toward Highland was all Norwegian, and there were some Swiss on the north side. Well, of course, I guess it was both ways. But anyway, I've seen pictures of a bridge that was a walking bridge across the Turkey, so that one of the apostolic families could walk across and go to church on the other side. So, yeah, that was kind of dividing line. But as time went on, people would get back and forth across the river, and so intermarrying started taking place, and what a wonderful thing that was.
When you were young, did they have Norwegian stories, and did they talk about Lesbe like they do now, or was that just so much of your life that it wasn't any?
Well, I don't know, you're referring to the Norwegian jokes that you hear nowadays about the stupidity of the Norwegian. Well, I think that's far exaggerated, but I think that Norwegian people basically take that in stride and enjoy the fun of it.
It's kind of remarkable that they can make fun of themselves.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're good people, you know. We really are.
Yeah. That's why I married one.
Yeah, you were smart, Harriet. That's right.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us or share?
No. Well, I just want to thank you for being a part of this, and I think it's great that this is being recorded and that this will be here for future generations. And I encourage people to spend some time in Elgin, and hopefully that they'll come back and be a permanent part of our community, because we can use a few additional families. Thank you, friend.
Thank you, Ivan. You're a wonderful storyteller.
Thank you.